I often get asked by many promising young players what the best way to improve at chess is. And there's one thing that always comes to my mind immediately, and that's tactics. Knowing the various tactics that are involved in a game of chess, and being able to spot them is one of the most important things you can do in order to improve. Take, for example, this game that Sergei Karjakin was playing in the Moscow Open in February 2004 against the very strong Russian Grandmaster Ernesto Inarkiev, rated over 2600. And here we see a very complicated position. It's black to move. Now, between here and the end of the game, there are three very important tactics that Sergei finds in order to gain an advantage at each moment. Here is the first one. Can you see what black should probably play in this position? Now, this knight on b4 is one that there's a certain square that we all like to go to, but unfortunately it's defended at the moment. How can black re-attack that square? Rook c8, bringing a piece in and attacking the queen on c4. The queen had to move, and now here comes the knight to c2. So a fairly basic tactic, you might think, but no one is there during a game to tell you that there is a tactic on the board. You have to spot the pattern. So black wins in exchange. Not the end of the game though, of course, and Inarkiev snaps a pawn. So after black wins the exchange, we can see that here white has two potentially strong passed queenside pawns. Of course, at the moment they're not very far advanced because they want to go to the end of the board. What can black do about it? If black's a little bit passive, i.e. black plays moves without any real aim, black is not really looking. For example, if we took on h4, which makes a lot of sense because we win a pawn, I think white would continue with b4 here. And before black knows it, those pawns are going to charge up the board with great effect. So black needs to be very careful here. And we now come across tactic number 2. Whether Inarkiev saw this, I do not know. But I'm going to guess it's a no, because I think it just allows black to gain a big advantage. Can you see how black can set up a nice double attack here? Knight takes e5, a bolt from the blue. And white, of course, thought that it was defended, but now came queen d5, and both of these knights are attacked. Of course, before playing it, Karjakin would have to be completely sure that everything was in his favour here, because if he overlooks something, he's just going to have lost a knight. So here we see actually everything is covered, and that's the hallmark of a very strong player. So queen d3 was played to protect the knight on e4, but of course that allowed black to take the knight on e5. So there already we've seen two tactics for black from the original position, and he's turned the game in his favour. Of course, white still has some chances here, and we're going to see white set up a tactic here of knight g5, a very typical idea where the queen and the knight are looking towards the square on h7. How are we going to deal with it? Of course, we could just take the knight on g5 like this, but I think after something like h takes g5, white still has this optimistic idea of playing the pawns out the board, and black has to be a little bit careful. Of course, black has a passed pawn himself on d4, but that pawn is blockaded by the queen. So white still has some hope here in this position. Karjakin decided to play g6. Not really a weakening move because all the squares around the king are covered already, so it's okay. The main question is, can white use these queenside pawns? So, b4, there we go. And queen f5. A sensible idea, trying to exchange off. And this also tempts white into playing queen takes d4, which appears to win a pawn, but we all know that Karjakin has tricks up his sleeve, and he would then play bishop f6, skewering the queen to the rook. So, we've seen this in many games of Karjakin's where he sets up little tricks like this, and it's especially useful in his rapid play games where his opponents will have less time to think about the tricks that he's putting on offer here. So, of course, we don't expect Inarkiev to fall for this, but black is trying to realise an aim of exchanging queens, because if that queen goes, the black pawn on d4 will be able to charge down the board. And not only that, the rook on c8 will now have a chance to infiltrate on c2. When you have an open file for your rooks, it's especially useful to have an infiltration point, and here we see black would actually have that in this position. So, white exchange queens, and g takes f5, capturing towards the centre. The king is actually very safe on g8 here, so there's no problem with that one. Rook b1, and now black's pawns start going, so we still reach a very interesting position here, and the game will be decided again by a tactic in just a few moves. So knight f3, the knight defends the bishop. How can we remove the defence? e4. This appears just to be quite easily winning for black, but there are still some tricks here. Bishop f4. White's pinning all of his hopes on these queenside pawns, so black took all the pieces on offer, and b6. It's one of those positions where if you had it in a game you'd think, well, I'm a rook ahead, I should be easily winning. But it's never that simple, especially faced with a 2600 rated Grandmaster on the other side of the board. If the pawn goes to b7, white already controls the queening square, and coupled with the fact that this a-pawn could also be quite strong, black should exercise a degree of caution here. And of course Karjakin spots that. Bishop c5 and bishop a7. So that prevents the a-pawn running all the way up the board any further than that. Of course it means that white can now win the bishop, but after this, black now can deflect white with this d-pawn. So very complicated position, but it's clear that Karjakin has not rushed any of these moves, and even though he knows he's winning, he still is taking his time to just work out, is everything going to be okay? What is my plan to try and finish this position off? And he does this with great effect. So rook d8, the initiative is now back with him. He's now going to push his d-pawn. White has to worry about defending rather than attacking. Rook d1, d2. So that rook, which was helping the b-pawn push up the board, now has to perform a defensive function. Not really what it wants to do. King h2. And in this position, white played king g3. It appears that white has everything covered, because after something like rook takes a4, white would play king takes f3. And white has some chances to make a draw now. The point being that after king e2, the pawn on d2 will probably be captured. And because black has this weakened structure on the king side, these pawns are what we say very immobile. They're not that useful in order to make a pass pawn. So Karjakin decided, well, I feel like there might be a tactic in this position. Is there anything I can do? Can you see how black can win from this position immediately? Karjakin played f4 check, sacrificing the rook, but utilising the fact that he's now going to make a pass pawn, which is going to force the rook on d1 to give itself up, and that will be easily winning for black. Let's see how this would come about. For example, bishop takes f4, rook takes f4. This was the idea, and f takes g2, king f3, and now the killer blow, rook c1. White is unable to prevent black queening one of these pawns. If we just go back after f4 check, if he was to capture on h4, black would capture the bishop, threatening e2. So we capture that one, and f takes g2 will lead to exactly the same idea after king g3, rook c1. So there was 3 tactics there that Sergei played from the position after move 20, and he turned the game in his favour every single time. So there you go. Study your tactics and you are sure to improve.